All right, thank you very much, everybody. Billy, that was awesome. It was a great lead-in. It was very poignant what you were saying, and I think it leads in quite nicely to my talk. Firstly, I want to sort of take off where Billy left and introduce you to a concept. It's actually a phrase from Maori culture. It's a saying, and it's sort of a quote as well. I've heard it said a few times, but if you listen, I hope some of the points Billy was trying to convey come through. The saying goes like this: as the river flows from the mountain to the sea, I am the river and the river is me. I thought that was a really beautiful quote when I first heard it, and I think although it sort of emerged out of that Maori concept of connectedness of people with nature, it's also more broadly applicable and transferable to other Indigenous cultures around the world, and even more so to the way you and I might feel when we're out in the environment. It really neatly expresses the Aboriginal concept here in Australia, that the health of the country and the health of the people are intrinsically linked, intertwined. And it really is the rationale for the notion that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that country needs people just as much as people need country. Hence the beautiful painting by Alinytjara from up in the APY lands. Second concept, proper planning prevents poor performance. That's a pretty self-evident one, but this emerged out of, apparently from the British Army. It's a shortcut from the original 7 Ps. There was a proper planning and preparation prevent poor performance. And the second P is a slang term for alcohol, which I don't need to repeat here. So I want to talk about healthy country planning, and I know that people will be variously familiar with it. Some people might have sort of quite an understanding, other people will be completely new, and I want to talk about how it's really sits at the interface of these two concepts. So I think Billy did a fantastic job of shining that light on Indigenous knowledge and the value that's contained within that. And I think what healthy country planning really aims to do is to sort of pick the best of both worlds, or operate at the interface of both worlds, not saying one is better than the other, but really acknowledging that there are different ways of seeing and doing things, and that we'd do well to incorporate different elements of those approaches. So really, on the left-hand side up near the Alinytjara painting, you have the spiritual, social and cultural understanding and appreciation of country, and you don't want to lose that in your more sort of policy scientific framework, which is a space where a lot of us, I'd say, predominantly work. It is a defined, it's a process rather than a it's fairly flexible, but it does have some key characteristics, and it follows a pretty logical cycle of these 5 steps, which I'll go through. It's essentially deciding what the plan will be about. So it's important to have a plan if you want to sort of achieve an end game. You can't just live in the current and not really know where we're heading. It's making that plan. I think the making the plan is really the bit where healthy country planning and what we learned earlier about engagement, direct engagement and so forth, that's where it's really unique in the nitty-gritty on-ground stuff. It's doing and monitoring of the work. It's doing that process of review, which we just saw up there. It's part of the Western, but it's also part of Indigenous construct. And then it's communicating that and constantly following this adaptive cycle, so making sure it remains relevant. So today, we don't need to get into the specifics of each of those the broad 5 focal areas, but really I want people to leave with a hopefully understanding and agreement, I suppose, of the core elements, which I see are, hopefully I'm going to explain to you how healthy country planning is international, it's community-led, it's socially and culturally appropriate, particularly here in the working with Indigenous communities here in Australia, and it follows a theory of change. So firstly, healthy country planning emerged out of the international NGO context. Lots of amazing projects happening around the world, WWF running them, BirdLife, Nature Conservancy and others. And really there came a bit of a realisation that what was needed with all these different projects happening in different places by different people was for a sort of an objective, consistent and transparent accounting of these actions that are going on, as well as the intended and actual outcomes. Because too often I think, you know, you might be part of a machine that's churning, but it's like, well, what effect are you having? So that's the space that emerged from. So look, we've got to do a better job of bringing to the forefront that consistency, objectivity, accounting, and are we getting where we want to go? So it's essentially the open standards adapted for this local Australian context, working with Indigenous communities. So to that effect, it's used by more than 20 organisations, groups around the country, including in Alinytjara, Wilurara, which is where I work, in the northwest of South Australia. So here we have a map of our region. You don't really need to know too much of the detail, but I want to say that we have a number of healthy country plans in existence, in review, and new ones underway. There's an area, one of the more well-known healthy country plans in the Far West Coast region, which is from the Nullarbor to the Yalata Cliffs, across into that Yalata IPA, Yellabinna Yumbra Conservation Park. Up north near Coopapedy in that sort of middle eastern Tallaringa Conservation Park. The Antakarinya Mountain Yankunytjara landowners up there have got a healthy country plan called the Manta Palya plan in language. And up in the north we have a healthy country plan up in some country that is not currently cared for by the Federal Indigenous Protected Areas program. So there's a few around and there's more underway. There's a bit of interest in the centre there in the Maralinga-Djaritja lands as well. So the other thing I wanted to convey that it was international, it's used widely in Australia, and this community-led part is probably the crux of it. This photo is actually from a country cabinet that was held in APY lands late last year, and although it's not a healthy country planning workshop as such, I think it really captures that approach quite well, because really what you have here is a knowledge transfer, and it's sort of similar to the photos we saw from Billy with the TOs out on country. Here we've got Lee Brady and his son, and all the politicians and CEs from government departments were up there for this cabinet, and part of a sort of activity we wandered off into the bush looking for maku, which is witchetty grub. So we're walking through the landscape. Lee's telling us about what you're searching for, what may be promising. We're passing through the landscape, and what it really conveys, I think, is that it sort of brings to the forefront that this is the way that community should be engaged in that space. So it's giving the voice to community. Lee's transferring knowledge up instead of that sort of top-down approach, which is a more historical type of approach. And it's happening on country by invitation, which is also important. More importantly, when you're out there, you see and feel. So here you're in amongst the buffel grass, you can understand straight away the importance of that weed, how it's changing culture, because you're hearing the stories, you're feeling and seeing the grass. So it really is that, in essence, see and feel rather than tell and do type approach. Moreover, it's really the socially and culturally responsible way to go about things. At a very basic level, engagement, you can just get out there and provide information. On the left-hand side of that sort of continuum, that's a pretty simplistic approach that doesn't really cut it these days. You can do a bit more than that. Healthy country planning is more towards that end of involving and empowering, because you're really putting the plans at the end of the day are owned by the Indigenous community who've created them in our instance, and we're there to play a support role in delivering, implementing those plans. So that's a pretty good space to be on that spectrum. So they're owned in full by community and other stakeholders, partners, whatever you want to call it, provide a support role. This is also links to that socially and culturally appropriate type emphasis. On the y-axis you could think of area as in a site or a property, fairly small scale, localised, and as you move up you might be getting into a landscape, larger level focus of your area of interest. Over here at the time scale You know, that could be months or a few years, and over there might be decades or more, 5 to 10 years or more. Healthy country planning is really in that top space. It's 5 to 10 years as a minimum, and it's over a landscape scale. More importantly, in terms of that time and area, always characteristics of these plans is that knowledge transfer between old and young is built into it. So you have every plan you pick up that exists will have components in there that have TOs taking young kids out on country to pass on that knowledge and to other people as well, more broadly. So pass that knowledge between us, the government, for instance, as well. There's that two-way approach. This is probably the most complex slide that just goes to show that it's more about that proper planning prevents poor performance. So that's essentially a results chain that says if then, if we do this, then hopefully that'll happen. If we do this, then that'll happen. Here's an example. You've got a target there where you have, at the very right, healthy sturgeon population, popular caviar fish in Europe. I think it's probably a real example, but it's effective either way. And you might have a media campaign. So the media campaign in this case says, you know, if we launch this media campaign, we can increase people's knowledge of the importance of sturgeon. We can increase their interest in the conservation of these animals because they'll be aware if they're declining or whatnot. And then consumers will hopefully take on that messaging, which might be not to eat caviar. That'll result to decreased demand for caviar. And you end up with that threat reduction of there's a reduced harvest for caviar. In that instance, it's probably fairly applicable to the international wildlife trade trafficking because you're looking at you're addressing the demand side. So, yeah. That's essentially the results chain part of making the plan. Each plan does have that sort of more stepwise approach to it to get to where you want to go. But that's the nitty-gritty that, you know, not everyone has to be abreast of. That can be internally, someone can be sort of responsible for that side of it. Links with policy. How much time, Glenn? Oh, no time? Okay. Links with policy. In terms of the theme today, you know, we've got strong links with policy. I just have this map because that's the large purple outline is the area of influence for the Far West Coast Healthy Country Plan. Over that, all you need to get is there's various types of land tenure. You've got conservation parks, wilderness reserves, regional reserves, etc. And, you know, it's the essence of co-management, working together towards shared outcomes. In terms of reconciliation, it's completely aligned with the three platforms that we have in Department for Environment, which is, you know, building relationships, increasing respect and cultural competency, and providing opportunities. For Alinytjara Wilurara, we have a strategic plan for 10 years, and the next iteration of that plan, which is due quite soon, is going to look like it's going to be a compilation of these healthy country plans. Therefore, we'll know that in the larger strategic plan, those activities are aligned with you know, the aspirations of the traditional owners in different parts of our region. The issues are the same, so rolling up works quite well. And essentially, the plans are usually a very positive process. TOs find it quite cathartic. It's like a healing process almost, because you are sharing that knowledge, you're getting it written down, you're putting things in place, you feel like you're doing. But obviously the best part has to be implementation, and that's where I think individually you can ask yourselves, or your organisations, where these exist, how you can help, is this an approach you might be able to use? Thank you very much.